recording. So I haven't shown the 3 videos yet, but we can do it now. It's near.
No, not quite yet. Let me
Right.
introduce them first, please.
Sure.
Okay. Good. Are we ready to begin?
We are 2 minutes short, so we can wait for one.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Do any students, as we're just starting, any students have any questions or concerns or either technical or procedural about the course based on what we mentioned? Although, yeah, so this is being recorded, so. We keep finding some interesting, exciting new things. It's hard to decide what to choose and what not to. There's too much coming along all the time. All right, 4:30. Let me gradually begin. Welcome again. We have several new people. We've been talking a fair amount among the teaching assistants and Kiji about participation and how with the new technology and the new things that we're finding, helping people be involved. I see the name right up there of Santiago Hafner, who's from Paris. Is there anyone else from France who's in the class? I'll ask. Anyone else from class? Yeah, okay, so I guess you could raise your, either just speak out. I mean, unmute yourself and speak out if anyone's lived in France more than Paris or France more than 10 years or so, or grew up in France. Okay, I'm asking because we've got lots of Chinese representation and things that fit with the course nicely include France, China, and the US. We tend to use them a lot, plus Chicago. And these are shockingly different in multiple ways that are nice. But okay, Santiago, we will rely on your French. You were De Gaulle. You were Joan of Arc, and more. So thank you. On different days. Okay, let's start briefly with some of the readings, and then begin to generalize a little bit more. The first reading in this section is Max Weber on aesthetics, and the big point which he makes in the very first is that sociologists and it's a powerful, because this comes from Weber himself, but in different ways you have the same point in Emil Durkheim and many sociologists through the 20th century, that most sociologists, most social scientists have ignored the arts. Why? Even especially, I would say, at the beginning of the late 19th century, the arts were arguably more powerful, more pervasive in defining and redefining life and how people think about the world and themselves. I would say the simple answer, which Weber doesn't quite say explicitly, is that they were so important that the social scientists felt inferior. They felt that how could they couldn't really, if they tried too much to stay with the arts and think and talk like the arts, they would just be overwhelmed and swamped. I think is the simple, crude answer. So they said, let's be scientists. Well, second, that to try to build something that was distinctly social scientific and scientific rather than artistic they couldn't outdo the arts as artists. That is, social scientists are not artists. I mean, I went to art school myself, so I can feel this. You know, and so I learned in art school, you know, I'm not going to be another Renoir. Sad news to me as a young art school student. But the next step is, okay, if you're going to be a social scientist, what can you do, and how can you do it in a way that's interesting and new and different? Well, you can bring systematic things. You can bring things which artists do not, but you can nevertheless try to use this in thinking about and analyzing the impacts of art or the style of art in ways that those are important for how people live their lives and choose what's right or wrong or whatever. Okay, so Weber doesn't quite put it that way. He almost puts it in the, he has two excerpts that I have on the reading list. The first they're both very short. The first is very short. The second's maybe 10, 15 pages. But the first basically says, we can't study the arts because it follows different rules. That is, the rules of the economy and the political system do not apply to the arts. Okay, I would say this is a common German late 19th century kind of statement that we have specialization, we have a knowledge base which is built for for instance, the social sciences or the human scholarly area, and we cannot use natural science because that's a different body of knowledge. Okay, that kind of argument was made that you can't, and it's it's almost protecting one's turf, I would say, in a crude sort of way. But Weber basically says that, but his second reading, he dives in and does what he says we can't do. He applies, that is, let me back up. Many of you know The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, his best known book. It's used in lots of courses. He then went on, basically, after showing in that book, the ironic connection between religion, and specifically Calvinist Protestantism, facilitated the emergence of modern society through such things as the elements of capitalism. But he didn't define capitalism as making money or being greedy or manipulating the stock market, whatever. He talked much more about rationality, and he had examples like writing the type of harmony that goes into a symphony was an illustration of the kind of mindset which is necessary to build a more complicated society, including capitalism. So he was even using in that example the arts to illustrate how to build a more subtle conception of capitalism, which in turn he then linked with, shocking everybody, religion. I mean, how can religion change the economy in that way? So he didn't quite say change. He avoided, and we'll talk about this later perhaps, he avoided causal language, but he talked about association. These things go together. Okay, and so in this essay, so let me add one more piece. After the Protestant Ethic, he basically said, is this true? Do these things hold, that this kind of Calvinist religion of sacrifice and a conception of God as an abstract entity, not a Roman Catholic more personal conception through the theology, and is articulated by the Roman Catholic Church in the most visible institution was confession, where you would talk to the priest and talk about what you'd done wrong in the last week, and he would advise you should change this or do that or do penance or whatever. That was clearly not part of Calvinism. Okay, so what he then did was, next couple of decades, he wrote books he did lots of research on ancient Judaism, China, and India, and said, how are these different, and why, as these were ancient civilizations, why didn't they develop what only happened hundreds and hundreds of years later in England. So England was the first country really to do these kinds of things. Why did it take so long? And what was wrong with the trying to turn on my light here. Okay. What was wrong with the wrong is too strong. What was incompatible with these developments within India and China, and how were they similar or overlapping with ancient Judaism? And so he did rather. So he added lots of subtlety in analyzing India and China. He then brought so step one is earlier European work. Step two is a Protestant ethic. Step three, China, India. Step four, he then came back and tried to generalize. And he did these often with what he called ideal types. So he then, and what we've got in this second essay comes from that. That is, it's a synthesis with examples from India, from China, from other places. He doesn't tell you where he drew these from. He doesn't say, as I said in chapter 23 of my book on India, I talked about, and he just dives in and mentions a certain type of Indian religion or a certain conception of an abstract view of the world. But for you and us at this point in this course, those specific historic links don't matter unless you want to, dig into them further for a paper or your own research. The big point, the takeaway for us here in this course is he shows very concretely how different conceptions of religion, of values, of self and identity drastically transform how we think aesthetically, how we define what is nice, good, or bad. And he applies this in two domains, which he did in sections just before and after these it's a book called Economy and Society. He has two areas which he says really don't fit the normal economy. These are art and aesthetics and personal erotic experiences or eros, the abstract conception of eros. He's not talking about physical bodily function or, four-letter words. He frames this in a very abstract, ethereal kind of way, in ways that he thinks of aesthetics, in ways that one can dream and one can pull these pieces together. And this can be love. It can be domination. It can be egalitarian. The point is he's pointing out that different persons with very different religious, cultural, so we're now using culture in two senses. The cultural background in the sense of religion, beliefs, what's right and wrong, broad values and norms. These in turn link with, in very different ways, conceptions of what's a good novel, what's a funny movie, humor. Humor is a very big and complicated kind of issue, and in ways that he illustrates with these concrete examples. Okay, let me stop there and ask if anyone has any quick comment or question on Max Weber. And there's tons of stuff on Max Weber, so we're giving you a little baby bit, and we'll bring in more as we proceed in the course. But any specific question here? Okay, I'll go on for now, as there's several things, and they do overlap and fit together. Let me say a word then about the Frankfurt School of Adorno and Horkheimer. Like Max Weber, they were in our major in shaping and defining sociological, social science approaches to culture. And so many people teaching courses, reading courses on culture still read this essay by Adorno and Horkheimer, although some of you may well imagine that it seems pretty wild, pretty outlandish, whatever. Um, it is still widely read, and we wanted to at least give you a flavor of what they had to say, um, and treating it, however, in its own context of seeing how they basically in various. I mean, one way to try to define what's their perspective. One way that people have defined it is to say it's a mixture of Marx and Freud. I was a student in Frankfurt myself, and Adorno one day said, "You were here during the war. You felt the boot of Hitler. Horkheimer and I went to America where it was even worse." Those people didn't realize that they were being forced through advertising to drive those big cars, to smoke those cigarettes, and to do all kinds of terrible things. Okay. Adorno was a brilliant guy, but he had two styles, if to simplify. The crude, clearly very simplistic, as in that quotation, but second, the very nuanced, subtle analyst, especially of music. He wrote books and books and books on music, and here he had strong, highly subtle, opinionated, elaborate views. When he was dealing with Richard Strauss or Wagner, but when he got to folk music, or he got to what's called American folk music, which was actively used by the Communist Party, or then in the 1960s, Joan Baez was one of the most popular, and he totally dismissed it and her as Quatsch, just garbage. Why did he dismiss this so totally? One, because of he basically was mostly dealing with was what was called high culture, and there was a more rigid distinction between so-called high and popular culture in that period. But second, important more generally, he had a view which some people just see as coming from nowhere, but we can try to think of where and why it has some meaning. He dismissed as non-artistic those activities which came from mechanical reproduction or records. So if you listen to something on a record, if you saw a film, that was not real art, because you didn't have a personal relationship with the musician performing in front of you. You had to have a personal contact, as in theater in contrast to film, live theater. So in that sense, if you just listened to or saw a television performance, or that is, if you listen to a recording rather than the in-person presence of a Joan Baez, and it was not only popular music, it was mechanically reproduced, and therefore it was garbage. Okay, if that applied to Joan Baez, that applies basically to everything in Hollywood. So you have in this essay not only analysis and occasional subtlety, you also have deep disgust and hatred for what they're writing about, and that brims over line after line in ways that lead them to overstatement and simplification. Nevertheless, it's been widely used, and some people say, "Oh yeah, this is the truth, undiluted." Okay, the simple argument. Can anybody want to make the simple argument of the paper for us? If we try to say in 2 or 3 sentences, what do they have to say? Go ahead and raise your hand so we can see your name, I guess, and unmute if you want to say a word or two. Anybody want to give us a shot at this? Don't be bashful. We take 3 or 4 big concepts and words. What are the key things? Capital, capitalism, the big film industries like MGM and Warner Brothers. The relation between the film companies and getting their films out to the viewers, and then what happens in the mind of the viewer. I mean, those are the core variables in a sense. How are they connected, and why are they connected the way that Adorno and Horkheimer posit? That's the big question. If we were following, let's say, what the Chinese are now talking about, when building a consumption-driven economy or a consumer-driven economy, which way would the causal line go among those variables? Or if we were, okay, Santiago, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically he says that technology in the culture industry, it produces a standardization of the tastes of users. For example, someone who he shows the example of a particular producer that I don't remember the name, but he says that when that person innovates, we don't appreciate the innovation in itself, but just the fact that we don't know why he like what were the technical processes through which that led to this innovation. But since it's different from the norm, we just say that, oh yeah, it's different, so it's amazing in itself. But we don't have like that intimate link with and that intimate knowledge of the process, the new innovation. I don't know if I made myself clear.
No, yes, and that's well put. That's part of it for sure, but that's a smaller, more subtle point. I'm asking really the very simple, big point, which is what causes what, and how do these things that I mentioned, from the capital and capitalism to the consumer viewer of the film, fit together? And the simple answer is that capital within capitalism drives the film industry. The top people, Mr. Warner himself, the Warner Brothers, they choose the films, they choose the content, and there is very little discussion within the essay about specific types. There are a few names mentioned, like Donald Duck and the like, but very little about aesthetic styles. They don't talk about, say, jazz versus Beethoven, or where and how one would change the rules of the game. They basically have one model which applies to all content of the Hollywood films. And it basically it starts with the variables I mentioned first: capitalism, the big film industry, big film companies, down to the local areas and down to the viewers. And it's basically the same story as in the anecdote. Those Americans, and that is why and how does it work in ways that many find objectionable? That is, there is no choice for the consumer. There's no self-expression at the bottom level. And in your example, the inventor doesn't really get, quote, credit. It's more the driver is capitalism and capital. And without spelling out or thinking through where and how these causal linkages might either be stronger or weaker, let me add that he wrote they wrote with the 1930s more in mind. Although this changed, there were lawsuits at the end of the 1930s saying the big film companies have too much power And from the late 30s onward, the Justice Department started to say, okay, you've got to break up some of this stuff. And the biggest thing happened it was only in, I think it's 1948. Many of the big companies like Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Warner Brothers owned local cinemas, local movie houses in towns across the U.S. So and they then would show in their movie houses the films which they would choose in Hollywood. Today, and so since then, the local movie houses in Lincoln, Nebraska may not be owned by MGM. They have to be separately owned by someone, if not in Lincoln, Nebraska, at least it can't be the same company as produces the films. And this was an antitrust Department of Justice decision which broke up that, in a sense, this integration of the film industry, so that the consumer, at least the local film house, could say, no, we're not just going to perform anything that you give us from Warner Brothers. We're going to choose. If we want to have other films, we can do so. Did this drastically change the content? I would say a little bit, but let me now begin to make a second important point. Let's think and talk a little bit about content more explicitly. Instead of just saying it's capitalist content, or that Americans smoke and drive cars because they're told to do so, let's ask about where and how the content may vary, and one, and two, let's look at some of the variations within Hollywood, especially in the 1930s, and where they transformed aspects of film later on. Let me just mention that Adorno himself and Horkheimer went to Hollywood. They spent the 1930s in Hollywood, late 30s, as did Thomas Mann, but also Bertolt Brecht. Many radical political Marxist critics, many very highly talented European writers, some associated with the film industry, but others like Prokofiev, probably the number one musical composer in Russia, was in Hollywood, and he was writing music for Hollywood films. He then went back in the mid-30s. He didn't like it. He went back and he worked explicitly with Stalin. Okay, so Hollywood included many very diverse people in the 1930s, and some of them started working with independent small film companies. Others got a little bit of money from a sympathetic director or producer within one of the bigger companies. And they made hundreds of films that and sometimes they teamed up with American mystery writers like Dashiell Hammett, and many of these were crime. And they got the name from the French Cahiers du Cinéma of the black films, les films noirs, in the 1950s. These and Humphrey Bogart was often a hero. These were tough guys. They were, but this then was really semi-underground films that they didn't get distributed widely at all. They might play for a day or two in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then not continue after that. However, they were made in Hollywood, and what happened? Why wasn't it bigger? I will point to a different way of interpreting this. If we look later on, what happened? In 1968, there was a film called Bonnie and Clyde. It was a blockbuster, and it linked with some of the style of the counterculture, which on college campuses around 68 was becoming more and more challenging, critical, questioning of the politics, of the worldview, of the ideology of the capitalist state, of Lyndon Johnson, of the Vietnam War, of strikes. There was unionization going on in local governments, and for government officials were not permitted to be in unions at that point, etc. So there were lots of challenging activities going on. And since then, we've had at least sometimes some film and theater along this line. Okay, one of the most visible was Bertolt Brecht, who was considered a leading both a Marxist theorist with his specific theory about culture. And he was committed to Marxism, but he wanted to use culture and the theater to bring people toward the revolution. And he wrote his plays explicitly with that in mind. And he stayed in Hollywood in the 1930s, talked and argued with some people there, and then after in the late 40s, he stayed on and finally then went back to what became East Germany, and was the informal, some have said, the sort of informal minister of culture of East Germany, because he was such a powerful intellectual influence for subtly using the arts and culture for advancing a communist perspective. Okay, how he did this and what Brecht brought to culture, I would say, is an important way of potentially challenging the Adorno-Horkheimer paper here and saying, where is the causal driver? Okay, let's to illustrate this, Alan, could you give us a few clips, please, to illustrate what Brecht was doing and how this in turn led to new sorts of film which are with us today. The first clip is from a New York play, but go ahead and just show it, which is joining.
Let me share this first.
Brecht with.
So is it Brecht?
The top one.
Okay, this one. Let me show.
With Donald Trump.
Yeah, this is it.
Believe me, 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 believe me. Our country is in serious trouble. I have no strategy. You know what my strategy is? Honesty. I say it like it is. The crime and violence, death, destruction, terrorism, and weakness. I alone can fix it. I will restore law and order to our country. I want to win, and I'll be so presidential, you won't believe it. You will be so proud of me. You are going to have elections unless believe me, folks. Believe me. Believe me. Believe me. Oh, believe me.
All right. We're going to show the next one. Professor, you need to turn on your mic. Hi, Terry. Terry.
Yeah. Sorry, I'd muted myself because the sound.
Oh, you're muted again. So could you turn on?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Just saying, Arturo was a Brecht play. It then has been taken over, and aspects of Trump are combined with it in this New York production, which you saw a clip from. And then third, we now want to look at a little bit of the original play just to give you a flavor of Brechtian irony. And the idea, irony for Brecht links with alienation in the Marxist sense. And what he's trying to do is shock you and alienate you so much from what you're seeing that you even though you may be bourgeois in background, in class background, you should be converted to be a revolutionary anti-capitalist. That's the goal of all of this. But he does it with humor, with teasing, and with emotion in ways that are artistically compelling. That's the trick of how to join those things that in ways that people find compelling, and that's what the aesthetic discussion is about, in ways that these connect the pieces. And what I'm stressing here, and which is not in Adorno's essay, is the content. How does the content affect the impact? Okay, let's go ahead and see a bit of this performance. This was Liverpool, England.
Landed here 15 years since, an ordinary Joe from the Bronx, with 7 solid miles, out of work, looking for direction. Then Kennedy spotted me an iron will to bring peace to the vegetable trade.
Yeah. Can you stop it just a second, Zhang? I just want to add that Arturo Ui takes place in Chicago, and Arturo wants to be the head of the Cauliflower Trust. The Cauliflower Trust is the big stuff, and obviously it's a parody of other things as well. But the Cauliflower Trust and their street names of Chicago's streets, this is Chicago's 1930s Al Capone writ large. Okay, sorry, let's go ahead. No sound. I hear no sound.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
To this end, I am buying in substantial hardware. Machine guns, armored cars, revolvers, hand grenades, other functions, and all the rest, whose important as you are, Chicago and Cicero, will have the only American citizen in protection. There's vegetables in other places too. Enough! I'm crying out for me! Detroit, Duluth, Connecticut, Flint, Pittsburgh, Little Rock, any place where men is bought and sold. Cleveland, Columbia, Tulsa, New York, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Missouri. I'll give up my dignity. And what they need are total
Okay. Let's go on to the third one. Just have a little discussion of the director in England. This is one of the top English theaters discussing Brecht.
From reading the theoretical work as somebody who is grappling with the profoundest truths about the theater and the very heart of what we talk about when we talk about the quality that we describe as theatrical. He sees a creeping naturalism that he knows in part is going to come from the most unnatural of all media, from film. And he's saying, don't try and compete with this. You know, you're going to lose, and it's not interesting. I mean, I think that what he's really talking about is the essential dialectic of the theater, which is that it creates an illusion that is both effective and not at the same time, that it asks you to believe deeply in something that you are absolutely aware is artificial and fake, and that you hold both of those feelings and awarenesses, belief and disbelief, in the same place, in the same impossible tension, and that you start to understand through theater, I think he means, to say, the double nature of reality.
But that's what life is like. You know, you can have Leona Lewis singing for the boys out in Afghanistan to try and lighten things up. And then 5 minutes after she's gone, poof, and we're not meant to sit comfortably and predict what's going to happen, because that's not what this play is about. And I think that the more they throw in things that are unexpected, the more that they shake you up when you feel like you know where this is going.
The new sort of modern way of talking about it is distanciation. And I think that, you know, it's making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, as he says. And as I was just saying, I feel that there's in a way, theater does that automatically.
Gary Sefton in the play, who's the guy, he plays the sergeant at the start, and he does all the bombs, and he does sound effects. He does the sound effects and various things. That to me is alienation. Because you see something that exists outside of the play, but in some weird way, and I still can't articulate why, in some weird way that was drawing me further into what was happening on the stage. Because there was something, you have the narrative and you have the story of what's going on, and then all of a sudden there's a man who exists outside the play doing sound effects of a bomb going off, of something else, but the people are experiencing what he is doing outside the play as a reality. And it does something very strange.
That's Brecht, absolutely Brecht, you know, very simple. And you may have noticed that also the stage personnel, such as the sound, lights, you know, and the stage technicians, where they would normally wear black, they would be in black during the production on stage, but not on this particular play. And Deborah Warner didn't want that. She wanted everyone to come as they are in their own clothes.
Stone by stone they climb and their efforts make them worn and weak. Broken down they barely make it back to bed.
It's not only that you can see all the stage crew coming on to do what their job would be, you know, behind the scenes. What Deborah has done as well is she's taken every single wall away, everything, and you see that you see the theatre itself as the theatre is.
Are we okay with?
Yeah. Okay. Let's stop. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Another substantive style point, if you will, is the American theater and film in much of the 20th century, and the Russians basically both had the same aesthetic, and it was articulated and implemented more in film, that you, the actor, should become the character that you were playing. Brecht said, no, you don't want to do that. We want a different aesthetic. We want alienation from you, the actor, and you convey that ironic distance. So when the British director was talking about distance or distanciation, that's a key Brechtian concept, and it links with the young Marx, whose essays on alienation in turn inform the use, I would say, even within the Communist Manifesto, as well as some of his other essays. You get aspects of culture and art as well as alienation when he writes about the lumpen, for instance. Look at comments on lumpen as a underclass. And it's also so Brecht, in a sense, is trying to draw us, the viewer, into the play emotionally, sharing fear of death, explosions, and so forth. At the same time, that and how can that be done when you're talking about wild things that seem to be far from me, like a cauliflower trust in Chicago, if you're a German viewer in the 1930s? Well, you have 2 or 3 meanings of the same thing and the same actor and the same play going on simultaneously. And in that sense, challenging, and why did this then take off? Parts of this took off in 1968, if you will, or that is the underground of the film noir became more central, more visible. I won't say central, nothing is central anymore, but a more visible, clear, coherent statement of perspective, which was identified by the French theorist, the film noir. One argument is students, young people, critical folks changed their ways, at least of articulating what they wanted to see. And if we think of the US in the last, at least say 5 years, most visibly, Bernard Sanders won the state of California, at least with the Democratic Party voters. Trump himself articulate a lot of alienation and anger and mixing of emotions in ways that are explicitly breaking the rules. And then labeling, using labels sometimes to try to be humorous, such as talking about corrupt Hillary, corrupt Hillary, corrupt Hillary, in ways that repeat things, or believe me, believe me, believe me, was in the sort of clip we saw at the beginning. That is, we're getting mixes of elements in which the art folds into the ideology, folds into what's in people's heads on Facebook and more. So the deliberate merging of these in distinctive ways is something we're experiencing now, I would say. And this very coronavirus and holding a class over the internet, we're in different places. All this, in a sense, are new experiences where we're thinking and we're doing new things with new rules of the game simultaneously. That is, and the contrast also, one could say, is with the 1950s Hollywood film conception, which you can identify with the personality of, I won't try to impute causality, but I'll simply say, look at the content, not just the capital, but the content of the films of, say, the Ten Commandments as a Hollywood film, which is being reshown every Easter week, apparently, on television for years. There's a huge contrast between the classic good and bad, the cowboy, and the outlaw, and the good wins, and the moralistic will triumph, and good is good and bad is bad. I mean, those simple lessons that we know from Hollywood films of the 50s no longer are being filmed by Hollywood in the same way, thanks in part to Brecht and Adorno and Horkheimer and the many others who were there in that period, even though their impacts did not become so widely seen and felt until 1968 and onward. Okay, so in a sense, that's a couple of comments about this. Edward Shills, Herbert Gans have gone into more details on critiquing Adorno, and this essay, Shills's paper is called Daydreams and Nightmares, Perspectives on Adorno's view of American society and culture, something of that sort. I won't try to go into all of that. I'm trying to frame this within the current context and the broader issues. Let me just mention one more. That is, one way is to write an essay, as Shills did, which is more answering on Adorno's own turf. And Shills basically said we should also pay attention to popular culture and to let poor people choose as they please, and to observe what those choices are, but one need not imply that there is no choice for less educated or different kinds of persons or people, et cetera, et cetera. The other way to go is to say, how much is this causal chain from capital through the film studios down to the individual citizen? That is, how much is advertising as well as the content of films changing what is in people's heads? In the 1930s, 40s, this was an open question. We had these brand new media, well, film through the 20th century, but radio was brand new. And one of the biggest companies, it's Columbia Broadcasting, was very interested to know, I mean, how much impact are we really having? And they teamed up with Paul Lazarsfeld and others at Columbia, the Bureau of Applied Social Research, and they did several big volumes of research and analysis. Lazarsfeld and Adorno knew each other and were rivals in a sense, both coming here as immigrants in the late 30s, both looking for ways of analyzing these questions. And Lazarsfeld himself had been working to recruit from a Marxist perspective, young people into the socialist and communist parties in Austria. So he was also doing psychological research on how we could make appeals that are more persuasive. He came to America and he said, you know, that's not the way American politics works. And he then started to say, how can we, and then he also looked at marketing, and he saw all this marketing industry in New York, and they weren't doing any research. They didn't know if they were having any impact with their advertising. And many people who were in the industry who wanted to say, of course, my advertising firm will sell your product, you know, give us more advertising and we'll make more profit for you. But nobody really knew. So Lazarsfeld started large surveys and as well as small detailed focus grouped analyses and so forth really came from this 1940s work of Lazarsfeld and Merton. But the big question was, how much impact do the mass media have on what's in people's heads? It's the same main theme as in the Adorno-Horkheimer paper. And Adorno started working with Lazarsfeld and company when et al. When he first came, but they had a parting of the ways very soon, and Adorno and Horkheimer went on to Hollywood. The details are in the many books. They're not. We don't try to cover this in here. It's just really mass media effects and so forth. But most of the people doing the research basically have concluded that Lazarsfeld was largely right and Adorno was wrong. That there was not this huge, and it wasn't just Adorno. There were lots of people who had all kinds of different political orientations who thought and at least wondered if how much advertising had an impact, and many of them felt there was a huge impact. And the basic, and so one thing Lazarsfeld did, for instance, was to do studies of political, like now, political national presidential primary elections, and to do what was called a panel survey. You re-interview the same people, say once a month, and ask them what their views are about the political candidates and are they changing. And if there would be a move through the media and people would be influenced by what they see, that could be kept separate from what they were doing in their own lives. And basically, to the surprise of some, there were very few changes over the time period, and because there were re-interviews once a month through much of this period. But what they also did was not to do a national sample survey as has often been done by the Michigan people since. Rather, they did this in a couple of different small towns small medium towns where they could talk to people and interview and get information on who talked to whom. That is, the personal relations were a key part. And basically the concept emerged of the two-step influence process, where by the national media may say one thing, there may be a presidential debate, but how does it get to people's heads? And what they came up with was the critical potential role of people talking to their friends. And they may be 4 or 5 women who go shopping together on Saturday afternoon, who look for red shoes, and what kind of red shoes can they really get which go with their hair well. But then someone may say, you know, I don't like the red hair of that political candidate. Your shoes look too much like him, and you don't want to do that, do you? And that then they link to who are you voting for. So the point of Lazarsfeld was that unlike Austria, which looks more like the Marxist text, many aspects of American politics are more like selling or eating tomato soup or buying red shoes. All right, that's a bit of an overstatement, but it shows the similarities among these in ways that have also become discussed as well, discussed among analysts as well as criticized and lamented. But where and how these can be systematically studied is what has happened. These questions have been elaborated in the years since the 1940s, when both Adorno and Lazarsfeld came here and fed these into the U.S. context. Okay. Any quick comments, questions on what I've said here? How many of you have seen Bonnie and Clyde? I mean, yeah, okay, sorry, we don't have we're not set up for a poll, but I think we could just have people raise their hands. Can you click on raise your hand if you've seen Bonnie and Clyde? Can we see that in any way in our normal Zoom? I don't see anybody raising a hand. So nobody has seen Bonnie and Clyde? Okay. At least not enough to talk about. Well, glance at it on YouTube if you want. It was a landmark film. Let me say a word about Bourdieu, unless I'll be brief here because part of what he says in distinction overlaps with Adorno. That is, they both come from a background of strong Marxism. Bourdieu was not was unlike Brecht. He was not a committed Marxist. But he wrote in a context in Paris in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where Marxism was very, very strong, and dialoguing with concepts and topics that would resonate or variously link, but not doing it in a dogmatic sort of way. So instead of talking about bourgeois and proletariat, he would talk about the higher and the lower, and in more general terms. But he was quite a character. I knew him well when I was doing my PhD in those years, I was the only American he knew for about 5 years, and he would send me manuscripts. We'd send stuff back and forth and critique each other and so forth. But the quick comment is that social class, in a loose sense of high versus low, that the causal line is from high to low. That the poor people follow the model of the elite, and I then add quickly that Bourdieu, implicitly like Adorno, is really talking about what was more common then: elite or high art, not popular culture. He was not talking about Elvis Presley or Michael Jackson at all. He's talking about Beethoven and Monet, and wrote a long book at the end of his life on Monet, with lots of aesthetic sensitivity. Similarly, in the book Distinction, he draws on the generally, and here Santiago can fill in maybe something else. That is, I would say the French in general, the Parisians have part of their continual culture, at least this, and the tourists the tourists and the French advertising, which is very thoughtful and self-consciously done, play up how you can be more sophisticated if you come to and you buy or you put Chanel No. 9 on your own self. You can be a more glamorous person. And this helps to sell perfume, shoes, wine, cheese, foie gras, and so forth. And so the linkage of this, and we'll go into this more with the paper on Paris and from another German, Walter Benjamin, a little in another section a little further down. He spent the second half of his career really studying how Paris did this so powerfully and so successfully. But the point I'm making here is that Bourdieu draws on that. He almost copies and pastes sections of this kind of stuff. And that, to Americans, this has an aesthetic ring to it, which you don't get in most American sociology. So in that sense, I guess I'll just ask Santiago, if you have any sense of how different living in the US is from living in Paris in terms of the salience of aesthetics, which you can also see in Bourdieu's book, such as advertisements in magazines or television advertising, or more day-to-day, the ways that these reach down to you in day-to-day life. Any comments, say, on the differences? Hey, how long have you been in the US, Santiago?
I've lived there for about 8 months. But yeah, I thought about it a lot. And what I think it could be a good example, what I really thought about when I was looking at Trump speak, for instance, I think that reflecting on inequalities, for instance, in the US, in France, in comparison, in France, the way you speak is very important. For instance, Macron, when he's going to speak about the coronavirus right now, he's going to use a very aristocratic form of speaking. And I think that what distinguishes the social rise in France from the US would be that you have much more aesthetic ways of speaking or of dressing that are required to go up in the social classes, whereas in the US, I feel that even if that may exist, it's much more about like money, and you don't have all those stratifications.
Okay, so that is, many of you may have either seen films or visited France yourself, and you may have seen some of this on a simple descriptive level. But where and how these change things more generally, and how the introduction of aesthetics has changed people, I mentioned, and that's why Chicago is a fascinating case. Chicago had a classic image of the city of big shoulders. Max Weber came here because this was a city with it was like a man with his skin cut off. That is, you could see the writhing of the stomach and the liver and the intestines, with none of this European aristocratic gloss, whereas Paris is the opposite. So in that sense, to have Chicago become similar to Paris in the last 20 years is a revolution, in the sense that aesthetics have become visibly embraced by Richard Daley II, the son of the original Daley, continuing the old rough, tough Chicago tradition. We now have Chicago Fest. We have 4 months of entertainment, culture, popular culture, and people moving to Chicago, and both culture is not only appreciated, but it's an economic driver, and it's being discussed and analyzed in these terms. We should invest, and the city government is investing massive amounts of money into bringing and subsidizing performers, building stadiums, building theaters along the lakefront. We have 7, 8, 9. We have something like 150 performances within a few days in the Lollapalooza long half a week or so performances in ways that make this much more affordable, and it brings people here instead of going to New York or LA or Austin. And many of those people, I won't say, I don't know how many of the, I won't give you a number, but the point that, yeah, I think you've heard me say that the number of people in Chicago in the 4-mile downtown area from 25 to 34 has gone up faster than any other city in the US. So the importance of culture and the transformation of this whole image of Chicago using aesthetics to move, and Chicago has used Paris, as you see, for instance, in the bus stops. The bus stops in Chicago are made in France. They are serviced, they're cleaned. They put advertising on that has a Parisian company that does it in a way. Some of the big electronic signs, the most visible and high tech of those, are now made in France. And so these aspects of aesthetics are being plunked right into the middle of Chicago to try to transform Chicago's image in ways that in some ways like this directly follow Chicago. Not to mention some of the boulevards, the grand boulevards of the Haussmann Paris are imitated in Martin Luther King Drive and other boulevards in Chicago. Okay. Bourdieu, let me add as well context. Bourdieu was sort of coming into emerging as a social scientist at the same time that the Ministry of Culture was doing bigger things in France. It was only created under de Gaulle, and André Malraux, a very famous French novelist, was the first Minister of Culture. But the goal, even though whatever the politics of de Gaulle and Malraux was, they articulated that the goal and responsibility of the Ministry of Culture was to bring French culture to every French citizen, explicitly thus including the poor and the less educated persons. Okay, how to do that when you're using taxpayers' money has been a continually debated kind of issue in ways that is not the case if you're just having a private theater and private people buying their own tickets, not subsidized by someone else. So in that way, the politics of the ministry and of the French government are no longer dominated just by the king of Louis XIV building Versailles. Instead, you've got a more democratic kind of discussion. And so Macron and his way of framing this is interesting to compare and directly contrast with Trump in ways that it's great to have Santiago here. So Bourdieu does a little bit of this, but I would say using Chicago as a case to say how much of this is really coming from upper status, or how much is it something, if you learned how to dance in a particular dance at the Chicago Park District, and you're a low-income African-American living where I do in Bronzeville, lots of 10-year, 12-year-old kids go to Park District programs for 4 months in the summer, and 3-4 months, and they learn new things. And these are then discussed explicitly as in ways which are more analogous to a Ministry of Culture, if you will, than was true 10 or 20 years ago. That is, it was 1995 that Chicago really drastically changed in ways that, I said we're doing an oral history, so we could date it amazingly precisely, that the policy became much more explicitly following a Parisian kind of model in 1995 when Daley too was mayor. The point I'm making with these brief cases of Macron, Trump, Paris, Chicago is that these examples, these strong change cases in the case of Chicago, permit us to compare where and why the variables and the causal linkages among them in the essays by Bourdieu or Adorno can be tested both with multiple methods, with multiple approaches. But what Lazarsfeld and others added was the large N, the big N, quantitative comparison of thousands of neighborhoods, of thousands of or hundreds of films, where you can control income and education and aesthetic taste and many things which differ from place to place. And I'll simply add that the sense of aesthetic taste is, well, okay, I won't try to go too far along that line right now, except that, well, in one sentence, Bronzeville, where I live, I would say is consistent with more general African-American culture and taste in putting more, as I mentioned briefly a session or two back, more emphasis on aesthetics than most of the general white Catholic Chicago tradition. And so even though the white Catholic Chicago tradition, with especially Irish Catholics in the lead, is the dominant Chicago political style, the Bronzeville African-American style has been more sensitive to aesthetics in ways which now match what's going on with the transformations I'm mentioning through the Parks District or through the city's aesthetic effort to redefine the city by labeling the lower 1 mile south of the Chicago River the cultural mile. So seeing a city with this city of broad shoulders, messy, dirty, Al Capone, dirty steel mills background transforming itself shakes up the simple kinds of conceptions that we often have, including some of the writings of Adorno and Bourdieu. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for the moment without trying to go into evaluation research, but I mentioned we're doing evaluation research with the National Endowment for the Arts and reviewing all of the ways that the NEA is doing this in the US in some 300 art town projects across the country where these same questions are being posed. I mean, what programs are they doing, why, who's having an impact where, so forth. Let me mention then Ritzer briefly, just very briefly, and that the title of his book tells you a whole lot. The McDonaldization of society. That's the theme. This is what is happening. This is the way we should interpret what's happening now. But the difference from Marx or from Adorno is that the driver is not just the corporation, it's also consumption. That is, but also, I mean, but that's also true in the Hollywood essay of Adorno. That is, we're not dealing with producing widgets or anything which is produced. So that is the Asian export economy doesn't really focus on whether or not they're red shoes or not. It says it's something we can export like medical masks to the US or Western Europe. And if you can make money in those, fine. But the consumption areas like Hollywood film or McDonald's food, this becomes more complicatedly intertwined with lifestyle and choice of individuals in ways that the consumer is supposed to be, maybe, the leader, the taste setter, the driver, the economic policymaker, rather than capitalism. So that makes the arena of dealing with culture distinctly interesting and important and challenging to address, where we have these competing theories of top-down versus bottom-up. Okay, any questions or comments on that? Because we then want to say just a couple of words about Fleury and how Fleury then pulls these together. Okay, in the last reading. Questions or comments on what I've said, or if anybody wants to introduce any variations in terms of, say, the salience or the rise of aesthetics, as you've heard me mention a little bit other places, but anyone want to mention a place where you've grown up or seen this dramatically happen in a city or a country like Singapore, or China, maybe. But maybe not the whole
Yeah,
country.
I just wanted to comment, give a comment,
Yes. Go ahead,
and then
Johnson.
and sort of unrelated question as well. The first comment would be, I was actually in China for 8 weeks this summer interning, and when I was in Shanghai, like on the Bund area, China's really interesting in that, you know, I think that we had mentioned it in the first class, but at night they, you know, seek to have people come out more and to tempt people to come out and to interact with one another and to consume by lighting up the skyline and to making the buildings almost like dynamic in terms of, you know, they'll put like projector on the base of a building and have like a video playing on the side of a building, and they'll make, you know, the windows display like video. So when you're looking from afar on the sky, you know, and looking at the skyline, it's really interesting to see the skyline sort of light up. It's much more interactive and intimate in that sense. And then I would say, you know, with regards to my question, more related to Chicago and sort of how the park increases consumption by making the environment a little bit more like there's more self-expression in Chicago. And, you know, I like that portion of chapter 4 of Scenescapes. One of the questions that I had as a result of, you know, the park committee in Chicago, like wanting to incentivize like self-expression and to allow it to thrive, is why did they then make it very difficult for the George Lucas's like Star Wars museum to come to Chicago? Because from what I understand, that was going to be like a multi-billion dollar like revenue driver for the, in terms of like tax flow on like sales tax and property tax as well. Just any insight on that?
Now, the answer is very simple and clear, that there has been a prohibition on any building or construction within, I think, 1 mile or a certain distance from the lakefront. And this was part of what was called the Burnham Plan in the 19th century, which in that sense was purely aesthetic. That in Manhattan, they don't have a Burnham Plan, and the skyscrapers and buildings in Manhattan go right out to the edge of every street, right over to the water surrounding Manhattan. So by contrast, if you drive up Lakeshore Drive, or if you bicycle or run or walk up the lakefront, this gives you a view of the city from a distance through the park, which is quite unique among cities in the world, and that's been true since the night. So in terms of planning, and at least, and we have very minimal planning in Chicago, but that's been one of the most quasi-sacred things which should not be done. There was also a legal group called Friends of the Park, started a couple of decades ago, and so they in this case of Lucas, they filed a lawsuit and said, you know, this is complete violation of the Burnham Plan. This cannot be done. What you're doing is a, you know, total violation of Chicago's traditions for over a century, and basically it lost for that reason. So yes, so the city lost a lot of money in taxes and potential tourism and so forth, but it was so much in conflict with that bit of preserving the lakefront as Chicago's most important amenity that it was turned down. But your point about the lighting and the night lighting of Shanghai is excellent, because Chicago has done a little bit, very, very little. LA has done more with Hollywood and sort of the Hollywood neighborhood of featuring a new film and having those very bright lights from maybe even from the 1940s onward as one of the markers of Hollywood. But in Shanghai, as you're describing, it's being done with much more subtle elaboration, and it's a perfect visible illustration of just what I'm talking about. So thank you. Any other? Let's see, 5:47. Yeah. Now wait a minute. Now we've got just a couple of minutes. Okay, let's discuss more generally. I won't try to talk about Fleury for now. If we have any other comments or questions, we want to encourage more discussion if we can in a few minutes now. I don't want to go over time the way I did before. Nobody? Lots of people out there. Lance, any other comments from what we've said today? Or readings?
Hello, Professor.
Yeah,
I'm
I
So
guess
Yoon.
one question that I had for the chat.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Lance, would you let Su Yun Lee go ahead as you did get one question already? So Su Yun, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't know Lance was also speaking
Sure.
at the same time. I just wanted to answer to like your previous question about sort of our experiences of seeing like cities transforming in terms of like aesthetics. So I grew up in Korea. I didn't necessarily live in Seoul when I was younger, but I just like know of the history of the different cities in Korea. And then where I lived in was one of those satellite cities, which had the exact same planning in terms of, and it wasn't necessarily aesthetic, but it was more ergonomic. And I think it's really interesting to think about how, if you look at the history of the so-called the global south or like the third world, um, there was like an introduction of like foreign elements in terms of architecture and aesthetics as like liberalization and then sort of globalization happened. So I'm wondering like for those so-called third world cities, like maybe like in terms of the aesthetics, there's also like this idea of like foreign kind of, and also in terms of like post-colonial kind of like elements in play in terms of how the aesthetics of the cities are created. So I just wanted to bring that up. But I guess we're kind of out of time. So yeah,
No,
thank you.
it's a great big question, but I would say we will be trying to address that very question in many of the sessions which continue in this course. So it's not being put aside. And the case, the critical, the internationally critically important case of Seoul, we will talk about more than once because what you describe is major. And in global perspective, what we're doing in Chicago and Paris, Seoul is 4 times bigger than New York and Paris and so forth. There are massive amounts of resources being put into this in Korea. And it's happening much faster, much more actively, much more self-consciously. And so the Chinese and other Asians, the Chinese and Japanese and others are looking very thoughtfully at Korea because Koreans have been so creative in doing this, even though, as you pointed out, the GNP of Korea was not very far from Africa in 1945. So it's a hugely successful, rapidly developing economy and society, and it is drastically now incorporating aesthetics in ways that fit with the course and the city of Chicago. So we will talk about it more. Thank you for raising it. We didn't. Oh, sorry. No. We have to have a little bit. Brandon was going to say. I forgot. Brandon, could you just say a word about discussion board postings as we've been coming up with this? Brandon, you there? Yeah,
I'm here. We just, I don't know if they've been made live yet, but we kind of just like created a bunch of topics on the discussion boards. So there were already sections about like responding to class readings that some of you have been posting in. And I responded to like a couple of you I responded once to a couple of you with some thoughts and like different journalistic articles or like academic publications. So there are some like they're divided among geographic areas. They're divided among like different topics. or like methodological approaches. So if you're interested in like a certain area or a certain topic, a certain approach, like a couple things have been coming up, like there's a lot of interest in Asia. There's a lot of interest in like gentrification. So like I encourage you to, you know, like post on those, even if you're just saying like, hey, I'm interested in this, like as a way to find other people in the class who are interested. And if we get like enough interest in some of the topics, we could maybe have like smaller like sessions like away from the main class where we could like deal with those things more explicitly, like either with a view to like developing like a paper for this class, or maybe you're trying to think about a BA project in the future, or a master's thesis, or maybe you're just interested in like, that's it. Those are all fine, and those are all like good reasons to be participating in the discussion boards. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
So discussion boards and office hours, we remind you, are posted for all of us. I will put up, but Brandon, you can mention you've met your own office hours are, you said Thursday, or you have an afternoon office hour time. Okay, but basically Brandon is also available, and I'll try to post another version of the syllabus with his email and office hours for contacting him, as well as all of us. And this is now Monday. A couple of us have office hours listed as right now. So if any of you students want to stay on for office hours right now, several of us will stay on, and we can chat further right now. Some others are available on Wednesdays right after class as well. So those are 2 times, and then there are other times which we have listed on the syllabus too. Okay, thank you all. Is anyone staying on? Any students, maybe raise your hand or whatever if you're staying on for office hour discussions.